Hello, my name is Tricia Pritikin. I'm a Hanford downwinder and the author of the Hanford Plaintiffs, Voices from the Fight for Atomic Justice, published in 2020 by the University Press of Kansas. The Hanford Plaintiffs introduces 24 plaintiffs in the now concluded mass toxic tort personal injury litigation known as In re Hanford Nuclear Reservation Litigation, or In re Hanford for short. This litigation was filed against former contractors of the Hanford Nuclear Weapons Facility in south central Washington state, contractors that operated the facility during the wartime Manhattan Project and the ensuing Cold War years. The plaintiffs, referred to as downwinders, grew up within Hanford's vast radioactive shadow that covered eastern Washington, northern Oregon, Idaho, and western Montana. The plaintiffs were the children of farm families and military families. Some, like me, were the children of Hanford workers. The Hanford plaintiffs interweaves the stories of the Hanford downwinders with kindred stories of injured civilians downwind of atmospheric atomic tests conducted at the Nevada test site beginning in 1951. The introduction of the Hanford plaintiffs was written by Karen Dorn Steele, the former investigative reporter with the Spokesman Review in Spokane, who broke the story of cancers and other illnesses across the Columbia River in the farmlands from the Hanford facility. The book's foreword was co-authored by Tom Folds and Richard Iman, two of the attorneys who represented the downwinder plaintiffs in re Hanford. With the support of Cindy Kelly and the Atomic Heritage Foundation, Karen Dorn Steele and I conducted videotaped interviews with Tom Folds and Richard Iman in order to preserve their insights on the course and outcome of the litigation. Those interviews and many others are available online within the Atomic Heritage Foundation's Voices of the Manhattan Project collection, found at www.manhattanprojectvoices.org. With the kind permission of Cindy Kelly and the Atomic Heritage Foundation, I have included portions of the interviews with Folds and Iman, along with an interview I conducted with Karen Dorn Steele today in this video in order that the viewers can hear from them directly. Hanford, located on the Columbia River in south central Washington state, was a key nuclear weapons manufacturing facility for the World War II Manhattan Project and for the ensuing Cold War nuclear weapons buildup. Hanford produced the plutonium for the world's first test of an atomic bomb, the Trinity test, detonated in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, and for Fat Man, the bomb that decimated Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Hanford continued to produce plutonium throughout the Cold War, secretly releasing radioactive byproducts throughout the air of much of the Pacific Northwest, as well as into the waters of the Columbia River. Hanford's off-site releases began with startup of the facility in late 1944 and continued for more than 40 years thereafter. It wasn't until 1986, 42 years after these releases began, that the public finally learned about Hanford's chronic irradiation of the Pacific Northwest and began to suspect that the facility could be the cause of cancers and other health issues suffered by many people downwind and downriver of the site. Cancer and other disease in those of us who grew up within Hanford's radioactive shadow provide compelling evidence of the human toll of Hanford operations. The downwinders' cancers and other health issues are identical to those seen in radiation-exposed nuclear workers. In nuclear workers, under federal law, these diseases are compensated as radiation caused. Not so for the downwinders. In the first interview you'll see today, I share my own story, not because it's exceptional, but rather because it is representative of many of the stories of those of us who grew up within Hanford's radioactive shadow. I was born and raised in Richland, the community closest to Hanford, and in this interview with Cindy Kelly, I described the strange health issues I faced as latency periods following exposure to Hanford's radiation ended and the first health issues began to appear. I was born and raised in Richland, Washington, the town closest to the Hanford nuclear weapons facility. I was born in late 1950, which is during the period of time the 4 decades of plutonium production at the facility. So that's relevant to the health issues that I will discuss later. But my dad worked in the 100 area, which was at the time, 5 production reactors, which was expanded over the years to the early 60s to 9 production reactors, and he oversaw the function of the reactors. He was a Cal Berkeley graduate and MIT graduate. My mom worked in stores, which is basically, as I understand it, a secretarial kind of services at Hanford. And when she got pregnant with me, after losing a baby before me, they immediately told her she decided not to work there anymore in case. So she stopped working there when she was pregnant with me. Was born at Cadleck Hospital. And as I grew up, I loved Richland because it was, the Atomic Energy Commission put a lot of money into making everybody in Richland, all the families, happy. There were cultural events, the schools were really good. I remember having teachers who had Tennessee accents because a lot of them had come from Oak Ridge to Richland. They interchanged between the Manhattan Project sites. And I remember great art classes, everything, I loved it. And so it seemed like a perfectly normal town to me. Picket fences. We lived in an F house, which is one of the alphabet houses. Alphabet houses in Richland now are preserved with little signs in front of them. You can take a historic tour of the alphabet houses. And mine was an F house, which is basically a 2-story box, but it seemed real big to me when I was little. So I went to Sacagawea Elementary School. So that was the happy part of childhood. And over the years, we moved away from Richland in 1960 when my dad was transferred with GE to San Jose, and then overseas, because a lot of the nuclear projects were being canceled in the United States by that time, and there were more reactors being built overseas, so we were sent to Spain. We lived in Madrid, and then he helped to construct a reactor up in the tiny town of Vitoria up in the north of Spain. And I loved that time. It was under Franco. It was a very amazing place to live under Francisco Franco, a dictatorship. And they had the Guardia Civil with guns on tops of buildings. And it was, as a young person, it was an amazing experience coming from the United States to live in a place like that. So after that, I came back. I started to have health issues at around age 18, and we didn't know what was wrong. I started to have my weight fluctuate from high to low without any changes in my diet. I would become overweight and then underweight, and I was sick. My stomach was upset, and my hair became brittle, and my period stopped, which is very upsetting to the Spanish culture to have a young girl's period stop. So I was sent to a Spanish doctor who couldn't figure out what was wrong, and finally they sent me back to the United States for health care while my family stayed in Spain. And I went to my grandmother's house in Spokane where she lived. I can't recall exactly what happened healthcare wise, but eventually my periods started up, but I was becoming tired. And this was about 8 years after the end of exposures at Hanford. And what I mean by that is, over the time I lived there in Richland, actually beginning in the late 1940s, Hanford began to release from chemical separations facilities on the site the byproducts of plutonium production into the air and the water without letting anyone know they were doing that. And so people downwind, people in Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, which were the 3 cities next to Hanford, and people through a vast downwind area were exposed to airborne radioactive particles, and to the communities down the Columbia River also got a lot of radiation from the stuff dumped into the Columbia River, which went all the way down to the mouth of the Columbia in the Pacific. So the exposures to children were primarily, but not exclusively, through the milk pathway, which means when babies were fed milk or milk products, or infants had dairy products, radioiodine was contained in those products because it had come out of the chemical separations areas, gone into the air. This is I-131 primarily, but also some of the other radionuclides of radioiodine. And it deposited on the pasture grass, and the cows and goats consumed it, and it made its way into the milk supply. So that was one of the primary exposure routes for a lot of the people there in the Tri-Cities and downwind. But that milk pathway was actually known much earlier than scientists admitted it was known. There's a report by Jim Thomas, who's a researcher who worked on Hanford-related issues, that showed that the milk pathway had been understood in the late 1940s. So you have to ask yourself why the scientists were taking such a risk with the population, particularly the children, who are much more susceptible to the effects of radiation. So what I was starting to experience when I was 18 was the results of those early exposures. My thyroid was shutting down, and that's why my weight was going up and down, and my hair was becoming kinky and not kinky, and then I felt sick and I started to get tired. That's a latency period that happens before you feel these effects of exposure. And the latency period for me had been from age 10 to about 18. So 8 years after the end of my exposures, I started to get sick. But nobody knew why I was getting sick, because there wasn't any information about what had happened at Hanford until 1986. And this was like about 1968, so no one had any idea what was wrong with me. I suffered a great deal and kept getting sicker and sicker. I went to the University of Washington after first going to Whitman College in Walla Walla and then to a school in Switzerland for a year. And I was still not real sick, but not real well, but still functioning. And then I went to University of Washington. In my second year, I developed cat scratch fever, which is very rare. It makes you very sick. I had a big tumor on my neck, and when I went to the health clinic, they said that it's only in people with damaged immune systems that they see this disease, because most people can resist it. Can't figure out where I got it. Took me months to get over it. Eventually I recovered, but I was getting tireder and tireder and starting to have muscle contractions. I'd be jogging to try to get off the extra weight I was gaining from who knows why. I had no idea why I was gaining weight. And I'd be jogging and suddenly my muscles would contract, like a tetany. So all these bizarre things were happening, and the health center didn't have any idea what was wrong, because we still didn't know about the Hanford releases, had no idea. So I was cutting back on my work. I graduated in occupational therapy from University of Washington, and I was getting tireder and tireder, so I thought I'll just take a part-time job as an OT, an occupational therapist. And then I thought, well, I started working with kids with disabilities in the courts as a guardian ad litem volunteer, and I realized it would be something I'd really like to do, to work with kids with disabilities and people with disabilities. So I applied to law school, and I was accepted into Hastings here in San Francisco. And I started there, and I did okay. I was still tired, but I pushed myself really hard, and I loved what I was studying. But in the second year of law school, I was interning for NASA Ames, on a special project to put people with disabilities into space on the space shuttle missions. And I loved this project. It was so awesome. And I was writing a law review article for it. And suddenly, I wasn't feeling really good. I really wasn't. I was tired. And so I was talking to the general counsel of Ames in our weekly meeting. I was a law clerk, and we had a meeting every week. And I suddenly collapsed on the floor. It felt like a heart attack. It was just so painful. I just collapsed on the floor. I couldn't breathe. I had terrible chest pain, and so they called the ambulance and hauled me to the hospital. And the results came back negative for a heart attack, but they thought my esophagus might have contracted, which is very unusual. And the theory now is that it was because my thyroid, which had autoimmune thyroiditis, so an autoimmune process in the thyroid, was right next to the esophagus, and it had irritated the esophagus and caused this contraction. And it was so painful that I had to not go to law school classes for a while, and I was just in misery. And from then it just went downhill. I had headaches, terrible headaches, everything just sort of started falling apart, you know, as if I'd reached a tipping point. I had horrible headaches. Sometimes I went through ups and downs of autoimmune thyroiditis, which means you can go through hyperthyroidism, then hypo, then hyper, then hypo, until your thyroid finally just dies. You know, apparently the I-131 had killed the thyroid through an autoimmune process. So I'd get panic attacks sitting in class, and I'd start sweating. And you know, this is typical of hyperthyroidism. I'd start sweating and shaking, and I wouldn't know what was wrong with me. And I'd have to go out of the class, which means I had to miss part of the lecture and get up, and the professor would be looking at me, "What's wrong with you?" And then this terrible pressure in my head. So I went to a couple of physicians and the law school medical clinic, and no one knew what was wrong with me. They tested me for diabetes and some other things, lupus, MS, nothing. Because we still didn't know what had happened at Hanford. Had the Department of Energy released this information earlier, it would have certainly helped a lot of us. So I was getting sicker and sicker, but I'm very determined as an individual, and I wasn't about to quit law school. So I kept going. I reduced my course load a little and took a class in the summer. I made it through. Hard to believe at this point, but I did make it through, even though my memory had been impaired as well. It's called, I can't remember the term for it, but if you look up, people who are supremely hypothyroid have some memory issues. And I couldn't remember certain things, so it made it doubly hard, because you have to remember a lot in law school. You know, you just have to remember voluminous amounts. So I made it through there, and then I got married to another student at Hastings, who I'm still married to. I love him dearly, and he's just my best friend. And we tried to have children, but I wasn't able to. Something was wrong. So I didn't know what to do. I was pretty darn sick by then also. I mean, really tired and very skinny. I just shrank down to 115 pounds, which is maybe 10 pounds below where I should be, and weak. And his father, who's Nathan Pritikin, the diet guy, you ever heard of Nathan Pritikin? That's my husband's dad. He was trying to figure out what's wrong with me, right? Because he likes medical mysteries and such, but he was sick at the same time himself with chronic leukemia, so he wasn't able to help me. He actually died before we figured out what was wrong. And so I went to Spokane in 1988. I got married in 85. We tried for 3 years to get pregnant, couldn't do it. Went to visit my grandmother in Spokane in 88. And happened to read an article by Karen Doran Steele, who is a reporter for the Spokesman Review, who reported on the downwinders issues, and she kind of broke the story on the off-site releases from Hanford after the 1986 release of all the documents from DOE. I saw this article saying that iodine 131 had been released downwind in the 1940s. And so I felt terrible when I read it, but then I felt great, because I was born in 1950, and I thought, oh, I'm so glad that I escaped that. So I was to learn later that that was only one of the first discoveries within the 70,000 pages of documents released in '86 by the Department of Energy. So it turns out I was exposed to all kinds of stuff when I was little, and that was what was happening with me. I took this article back to an infertility clinic here in California, and they realized they hadn't tested me for the TSH levels appropriately. There's a couple of tests they could do, and the one they did not reflect the fact that I was supremely hypothyroid. So I went into an endocrinologist who said I should be in a coma by now because I was so hypothyroid, and how was I functioning? And I didn't know how I was functioning. I think you got to be really determined to be. So nobody in California had really heard of Hanford, and they still haven't really heard of Hanford. So she thought, what is this place, Hanford, anyway, you know? So I was I was put on synthetic thyroid hormone, which I have to take for the rest of my life, and the next month I was pregnant. Meantime, I went over to UCSF, University of California, San Francisco Medical Library, to look up, whether somebody exposed to radioiodine can pass on issues to their kids, and all there was there really was the lifespan study, which used to be called the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission study on survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It said, don't worry, it's okay. So I'm like, okay, then I'm not going to worry about this pregnancy. Went on to have a full-term pregnancy, which is great. My daughter's 28 now. And then I decided to organize a meeting here in California, the first one ever held for Hanford downwinders who might be here, because a lot of people who used to live there have moved elsewhere. And about 100 people came. It was a big meeting. John Goffman came, who's a really renowned scientist who's now passed away, who used to work at Lawrence Livermore Lab and helped to extract the first plutonium here at Cal Berkeley. So he came, and it was covered by the national media. And the stories of people who came were heartbreaking. I mean, one after the other, people would say something like my experience, or they'd say, there's this other cancer I have in addition to thyroid cancer, or I have autoimmune problems, and I don't know whether they could have been caused by Hanford or not. Where can we get answers? So Tom Folds came out of his own pocket. We asked him to come. He is the attorney who represented a lot of the downwinders. And he talked to us, and it was the first time we'd had anyone sympathetic listening to us. And he told us about all the revelations of the 70,000 pages of documents released in 1986 in response to Freedom of Information Act requests and just public concern over Hanford. So later, many of us signed on to the litigation, Hanford litigation, and were represented by Tom. He was one of the first attorneys to file in that action. So, but some people had leukemias, some people had thyroid cancer, there's lymphomas, bladder cancer, breast cancers. So we had a lot of different issues, but we didn't have answers. And as we went on to the litigation, there were 5,000 plaintiffs originally. That's more than there were in the Nevada test site litigation, which was Allen v. U.S. So this is In re Hanford nuclear reservation litigation, filed I think in 1991, the first cases. As the years passed, my health continued to deteriorate. In 2009, Hurdle cells, which can be indicative of thyroid cancer, were detected in a growth on my thyroid. My father had died when a cancerous nodule or growth on his thyroid exploded into metastatic thyroid cancer that rapidly spread throughout his body. I was also considered at high risk for thyroid cancer, having been exposed to large amounts of radioactive iodide as an infant and child. It was decided that I should undergo a complete thyroidectomy. During the surgery, in addition to losing my thyroid, I lost 3 of 4 parathyroid glands, which has led to a disease which is lifelong called hypoparathyroidism, which can result in kidney failure, tetany, and seizures. Many of those of us who now suffer from serious health issues following childhood exposure to Hanford's low-dose ionizing radiation feel that In re Hanford, which dragged on for more than 24 years, failed to deliver meaningful justice for the downwinders, in spite of the best efforts of our dedicated attorneys. For people unfamiliar with the Hanford site and the Hanford downwinders story, Richard Eyman describes the purpose of the facility and what the litigation was all about.
It started building the place in about at the end of 1942, and they were online to produce plutonium by, I think, September 1944. This was part of the Manhattan Project. It totally changed the entire area of what is known as Richland, Kennewick, Pasco, Washington. I believe. They brought in 50,000 workers to build Hanford. And most of the people had no idea even what they were building when they built it, except that the contractors, which was DuPont at that time, which was on essentially a contract with the United States to create what turned out to be the atomic bomb. And so that's how it got started. Obviously, this was before Chernobyl, this was before Fukushima, it was before 3 Mile Island. Hanford itself is, I think, 580 square miles of essentially sagebrush scrubland, and they turned it into a manufacturing plant of essentially plutonium, which then was used in the bombs that were dropped on Japan. So at some point thereafter, although there were suspicions among those who were in charge of Hanford, those who were operating it, and by the way, DuPont got out of it early on and turned it over to other contractors, but essentially the secret of Hanford was kept until the late 1980s, in which FOIA requests, and one of which was a spokesman review in Spokane, sought information about really what had been done at Hanford and whether or not there had been releases of any radiation. And out of that, it came to be that incredible amounts of radiation had been released from Hanford, especially in the early days, starting in 1944, continuing very heavily into the early 1950s, at least of iodine-131, and there's the whole entire story behind that. Obviously, you've asked probably other persons who have been interviewed about what happened back when. But moving forward to your question with regard to the litigation, once it was determined that many, thousands in fact, possibly 15,000 to 25,000 people were exposed to radiation as downwinders, in other words, off campus from what was known as the Hanford Reservation. And given the fact that mysteriously for all these years, people had been having diseases or problems that were thyroid related, such as hypothyroidism, such as thyroid cancer. There was then a rush among some lawyers, I was not one of them, to sign up essentially persons who felt that they had been harmed by Hanford. And that led to essentially even lawyers going town to town, downwind. Now downwind, what does that mean? Downwind from Hanford is an interesting question. The government looked at it as one way, and just to show you, the government's interpretation of Hanford as shown here, this shows the Hanford Reservation. Their interpretation of those that were downwind was essentially a small area just around Hanford itself. The real story shown here is that all of this area received radiation from Hanford. Hanford is the small white dot here, and through different studies that had been done, and this one is the government study, which is, I think, has been proven to be quite erroneous. It gave doses, and you can see that those doses immediately right next to Hanford had 100 to 235 rads. If you happen to be a young child aged from birth up until probably 10 years old, you would be subjected to 135 rads. Now I say that, and to put that in context as far as the litigation is concerned, this was the government's interpretation of the exposure to the dose that was to these particular young adults downward to those at birth. And so you can see we're sitting in Spokane today, and Spokane is sitting on the edge of what they said at that time was essentially 3.2 rads down to 10 rads. Later experts, especially those that were brought in by the plaintiffs in this particular case, found out that this was underestimated on a frame of like 1 to 8. In other words, 8 times as much radiation exposure to these people as was indicated by the government. One of the big things that arose out of the fact that all of a sudden there was a case against the contractors and essentially the United States government, which was defending. And there's a story behind that. But essentially, the government agreed at the very start of this to indemnify the contractors for any harm that might occur to any individual. And so essentially, the litigation itself was defended essentially by the Department of Energy of the United States and the United States itself.
Gaseous radioactive iodine, also called I-131, was one of the airborne byproducts released from the chemical extraction of plutonium at Hanford. Thyroid cancer and thyroid disease, which can be caused by exposure to I-131, were the primary diseases that were the focus of the litigation. This is because I-131 is one of the few radionuclides for which epidemiological studies have been conducted on the connection between exposure and disease. These studies supporting the link between exposure and resulting cancer and other diseases were essential to proving causation in the case. Unfortunately, though, I-131 was only one of the many radioactive gases secretly released from Hanford. Attorney Tom Folds describes some of Hanford's other radioactive gases that were never quantified and for which the downwinders' exposures were never determined.
This nuclear process that converted the 238 into plutonium also created a number of other isotopes, one of which was iodine-131, which is a radioactive gas that deposits downwind. Now, this radioactive gas, iodine-131, as I'm sure you both are aware, that was the primary danger health effect as a result of this operation. Now, there was all sorts of other isotopes and radionuclides created, particles that have never been able to quantify how many or what kind of a problem they created, but they certainly existed in great numbers.
Folds reveals that while Hanford officials attempted to protect their nuclear workers from exposure, they made no similar effort to protect civilians. Hanford operators vented gaseous radioactive iodine, which is heavier than air, out of 200-foot-tall stacks in order to ensure that the radioactive iodine traveled beyond the borders of the Hanford site before returning to the ground. The radioactive iodine instead deposited within downwind communities beyond the site's boundaries. Here, Tom Folds speaks about the radiation deposition onto communities outside Hanford's boundaries.
When they dissolved these fuel cells, they knew there were going to be a release of other products, such as iodine-131. And the operations were designed so their exhaust was put into a chimney 200 feet high and subject to tremendous pressure from enormously powerful blowers to push the plume up the 200 feet. They wanted to get it high enough so when it would release, the plume would be high enough and under enough pressure that it would travel before it touched ground. It would travel beyond the site. They sent it down to where all the downwinders lived, in effect. But their objective was really to protect the site, to get it away from, they wanted it moving fast enough and far enough to clear the site because they were concerned about the danger to workmen. And at that part of the design, they were not concerned with the downwind pollution that resulted. Okay?
Hanford officials believed that the public would suffer no harm if off-site I-131 releases were limited to less than 1 curie per day. However, the facility frequently emitted far more than 1 curie per day. Site operators and the Atomic Energy Commission decided against advising members of the public to take the simple protective measure of consuming non-radioactive iodine to protect the thyroid, as they didn't want to cause the public to become upset by finding out that the air was filled with gaseous radiation. In this excerpt that follows, Tom Folds talks about Hanford's releases and the lack of public warning.
So they empirically discovered that if you had a release from the facility of over 1 curie per day, that you would have a problem, a health problem. And so they knew, going back, how they made that determination. That was essentially also empirically. Among other things, they realized that a certain amount of iodine-131 would damage the thyroid of sheep. So based on that knowledge and other knowledge they had concerning the health effects of iodine-131, they recognized that the safe limit of operation would be 1 curie a day. Now, in actual fact, and the records show this, over about a 25-year period, they had releases vastly in excess of 1 curie per day. Many days they might have 30 curies, 40 curies, 50 curies, 10 curies. All right? Now that went on for a number of years, and they knew that was happening. Just a small digression. They also realized that if the person, and they knew this from the animals, and they also knew from personal exposure, that if the person in the downwind area that was vulnerable to this deposition, if they had taken thyroid, iodine, if they had taken non-radioactive iodine, regular iodine, like you might buy at your store, iodized salt, that it's not radioactive. If they had publicized to the population that everyone should start taking iodized salt, because they knew that that reduced their exposure by about 80%. But they decided, even though they discussed this idea of publicizing this precaution to the public, they decided against it because they were so concerned about the public being outraged or very upset by finding out what was going on.
While on-the-job radiation exposures to Hanford workers were carefully monitored, exposures to members of the public were neither disclosed nor monitored. The only way members of the public could later obtain a best guesses to what they had been exposed to was through a program called the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, or HEDR, which was conducted in part by the Department of Energy itself. HEDR has since been criticized as possibly having underestimated the downwinders' exposures. The radiation releases from the Hanford facility included a secret experiment called the Green Run, conducted December 2nd through 3rd of 1949, exposing downwind populations to high levels of radioactive iodine and other radionuclides. In the following interview, attorney Richard Iman shares the story of Deborah Clark. Deborah was a downwinder who at the time of trial was dying from thyroid cancer and had already lost a sister to thyroid cancer. Clark was born just days after the Green Run during a temperature inversion that caused high levels of I-131 to remain trapped in the area for days. Her exposures to I-131 occurred during very early infancy, which is a time when people are highly susceptible to the effects of radiation. HEDR calculated individual radiation exposure doses for the downwinders, and these doses were used at trial to determine whether Hanford's radiation could have caused individual cancers and other disease. As attorney Iman points out in this interview, Clark's exposure to the airborne radiation released in the Green Run was not considered by HEDR, resulting in underestimation of her dose and her inability to prove that Hanford's radiation caused her thyroid cancer.
One client who I came to know because I went out to her farm when she was a little kid. It's this lady here. And Deborah Clark had already lost a sister to thyroid cancer. She grew up on a little farm near a town called Umatilla, right on the Columbia River. And Deborah Clark already had thyroid cancer, and I learned from her by going down to where she grew up that her dad owned a dairy, a little dairy, 12 cows, and they supplied milk to people in Umatilla and to Pendleton. She had already had surgery on her thyroid. At the time that I went down and visited her, she had a hole right here in her neck. And the only way she could speak is to put her finger over this hole in her neck, so that you would be able, she'd be able to raspy tell you about her life. When I said spin, the HEDR dose, according to Mr. Van Wart, the lead trial counsel for HEDR, said that her dose was less than 1 rad. Okay, less than 1 rad because she was not around when the heavy doses came out. But I started doing some investigation into when she was born and what had happened around that time. The Green Run was a top secret U.S. government release of radioactive products, okay? This occurred December 2nd and December 3rd of 1949. Okay, and by the way, this lady was born 12 days later. This was a release that was to be detected by the United States Air Force, okay, with reconnaissance extending out some 500 miles. They had the planes ready to go to determine what the radiation was, radioactive iodine, that was being transmitted throughout the air, how far it would go, how fast it would go. There was, however, okay, this planned release, okay, encountered a problem in that there was an unpredicted 2-week weather inversion that we were able to determine occurred around that time, which essentially did not move the upper level winds. They stayed within 100 miles of Hanford. Sources indicate that this release alone, okay, out of the 550,000 curies that were released, this one released up to 12,000 curies into the air, and an even a greater amount of another radioisotope. But in any event, instead of being blown downwind into Canada and faraway reaches that the Air Force was prepared for, it hung around northern Oregon, the basin, which we call here in eastern Washington, and a bit into Idaho. And it was there for over 2 weeks. This lady was born, okay, while that inversion was going on. So she was an infant in Pendleton, Oregon, where she was born at this very time. The defense in this particular case refused to even take this inversion, the green run, into account. What we heard in court was she wasn't born until after the green run, and so why are they even bringing this up? I tried to get her, when I found out that from her doctor that she had 1 year to live. That was the prognostication, that she only had 1 year to live. And I went to court in a motion to give her an expedited trial. And the defense came back and said this was a stunt. Okay, the plaintiffs are pulling a stunt here. Okay, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get out of what the court's already decided is a planned avenue to determine the resolution of all of these cases, and why they want to favor this one lady with an expedited trial when all these other persons, okay, are not getting a trial. It is essentially an affront. And of course, what Mr. Van Wart said is words that this is, I can't believe that the court is even going to allow this to occur. And the fact that they're bringing it up, they're trying to cherry pick this one lady to go forward, okay? She had the true story of what happened, and according to our experts, they had totally miscalculated in Header and the other government study what the real doses were during the green run. Now, the green run was a very small portion of the total amount of radioactivity in terms of curies that had been emitted upon the public. But in any event, that green run that I just spoke of turned out to be so serious and so worried the government that they called a cessation of any more experiments like they had just done. And what they did during this thing, something that the defense and Hanford refused to really admit to, but now has admitted to, because this was an intentional release of radiation to find out. And it was essentially because they wanted to check to see what Russia was doing with regard to their development of atomic weapons. That was a real reason for it, and that's why they had this special intentional release. What they did was they removed all the filters that they had at the stack. So they removed them so fresh radioactive iodine, okay, went out into the air, and then, as I said, hung over the basin, hung over this 100-mile radius of Hanford at that time. That was not the only thing that the green run did. What they had been doing, green run's given its name from processing of the uranium. In other words, It's an open loop water-cooled nuclear reactor for the plutonium-239. And so essentially it meant fresh radiation, as opposed to what they had been doing in protecting the public downwind of going to a longer decay time of, they were going to a decay time of 83 to 101 days as of 1949, because originally they were using essentially the same as what they did during the Green Run. And so what they didn't, they put fresh radioactivity into the air, and this was all in the production of what was 30,000 nuclear weapons of various types that were amassed during the Cold War by the United States. So they intentionally made it fresh, and they essentially, these two studies done by the government, which were the foundation for HEDR, according to things that I have read, essentially grossly underestimated the amount of radiation that went into this lady and a lot of other kids and adults even at that particular time.
Many people who lived within Hanford's vast radioactive downwind and downriver region suffer from non-thyroid related cancers that may have been caused by their exposure to airborne and riverborne radiation released from Hanford. As Folds describes, the lack of epidemiological studies on the link between exposure to the other radionuclides released from Hanford and these cancers made it impossible for downwinder attorneys to prove causation with regard to these other cancers. Folds mentions a not well-publicized study of people who used Columbia River water for drinking or irrigation, or ate fish caught in the river. The study revealed significantly higher rates of various cancers in these individuals.
There were numerous people with other types of cancer. The problem that I had as an attorney was that I didn't have an accumulation of study specifically concerning you needed two things: the health effect, a specific cancer, not thyroid, but it's another kind of cancer, to a certain exposure, radioactive exposure. Now, I'm certain that these other cancers were created in many cases by the radioactivity, but I didn't have the study that would say, well, this kind of cancer, let's say a bone cancer, we have, it's caused by a certain radionuclide, and then of course that's not enough, you gotta go further. And we can also show there was a wide exposure to that specific radionuclide. So these other cancers could not be quantified and analyzed. The only one that we could do for sure was the thyroid damage from iodine-131. And interestingly enough, there was a guy that made a study. It never got much publicity, but he studied the rate of cancers of any sort to people, to persons that lived on counties that were adjoining the river, Columbia River, and that who were using Columbia River water for their irrigation and for their own ingestion. And he determined that those counties that were doing that had a significantly higher rate of all sorts of cancers. Not specific, but general rate of how many cancers per 100,000 people that they are able to develop. And these counties along it was downriver from Hanford, along the Columbia, they had significant greater incidence of cancers of all sorts. He was able to establish that quite definitely.
It was the courageous investigative journalist Karen Dorn Steele at the Spokesman Review in Spokane who helped break the story of Hanford's decades of off-site radiation releases. In this interview, Steele describes the somewhat circuitous route that led her to reporting on cancers and other diseases in farm families across the Columbia River from Hanford. Now, when did you start to be interested in Hanford as a topic?
Well, I arrived at the Spokesman Review in 1983, or the end of 82, and one of the big regional topics that just was emerging at that time was whether Hanford was going to become the nation's prime waste repository for high-level nuclear waste, predominantly fuel rods from commercial reactors around the country. And there were several sites being considered. There was a site in Texas, and there was a site at Yucca Mountain in Nevada, and Hanford. And in order to evaluate whether Hanford was an appropriate place to put all this fuel in basalt deep under the ground right next to the Columbia River, I'd studied geology in college, so I knew that basalt is full of cracks. I tried to find as many sources, both within the Department of Energy, which was pushing this project, and outside people, and I found reports from the U.S. Geological Survey that just panned the idea of Hanford as a site at the same time that Hanford officials were cheerleading for it. And they had moved, actually the Department of Energy had moved Hanford up to #1 on its list, and the U.S. Geological Survey was saying no way should this site even be considered. And so I did a series of articles on what was called BWIP, the Basalt Waste Isolation Project. And it was the first time that anybody had written stories that challenged their narrative about what should happen. So that was my first set of Hanford stories.
Did you get any flack from these? Did you have, were there people, powerful people criticizing your work at this point?
Not later on. I think there was more surprise that the Spokane paper was even covering this subject, because it hadn't in the past. Spokane had been very conventional. It had very little investigative reporting. It had relied on the Associated Press, basically just AP stories, to put in the paper about Hanford. And so suddenly, you know, the wire services were wondering, well, why is this person in Spokane, and why is the Spokane paper taking up these Hanford subjects?
Got it.
So.
Okay. So now around this time, was it around this time that you filed your first FOIA request?
Yes, it was. After I had done the Basalt Waste Isolation Project stories, you know, my byline was out there as someone at our paper interested in these subjects. And this was the early days of the Reagan administration, and Reagan had announced a major new nuclear weapons buildup and the restart of the Purex plant in 1984. And so one day in 1984, I got a call from a woman who said she was an engineer at Purex, and she said the plant is unsafe, and one day we're going to blow up Pasco. Those were her literal words. Of course, that got my attention, and so I told my editors what I'd heard, and of course I had no idea who she was. She might have been crazy, she might have been legitimate, but I drove there and checked into a motel, and then she came to my motel and showed me her security clearance, and we got started. And what she was telling me is what 40 kilograms of plutonium had been listed as missing from the Purex plant. Nobody knew what missing meant. Stolen, you know, someplace it shouldn't have been, building up in the bend of a pipe that might cause a criticality accident eventually, you know, where the thing would explode. And she told me, she gave me some roadblocks as to where to look in documents. She said, look for reports called MUFs, and I had no idea what that was, and it was materials unaccounted for. And so that was my first Freedom of Information Act request, to look for the reports on the missing plutonium at Hanford. And she was right. I mean, I got the reports. It did trigger an FBI visit to the newsroom because, again, a sense of surprise. Well, here's a Spokane paper all of a sudden doing these Hanford stories. And so my editor was asked, what is she doing? Why is she asking about missing plutonium? And my editor, to his credit, said, thank you. When you report the story, when we report the story, you'll know what we found, and ushered the man out the door. The offices of the FBI were right across the street from the newspaper, so he didn't have to come from far. But nonetheless, yeah, that was the first reaction I got, that the national security state had some interest in why we were asking for these documents.
Were your editors becoming increasingly supportive at this point of what you were doing, or were they interested in Hanford at this point?
Well, I think I was sort of pushing them in that direction. But when we got to the human health tolls of Hanford a little bit later, I had some real convincing to do. But we did publish the report on the missing plutonium, backed up by the documents, and a month later, the Department of Energy opened Purex for the first time ever to a press tour. And they were trying to, show us that everything was really, had everything under control, basically. And we came, the Oregonian, the Seattle Times, the spokesman paper, other papers, TV stations, and we brought, I decided that we needed an independent scientist to sort of corroborate what they were saying internally. So we brought in Tom Cochran from the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C. He was a prominent physicist. And so he attended the tour also.
Interesting. Did you recall what his reaction was to the tour, Tom Cochran?
Well, he was skeptical of the perfectly safe, and he asked some very probing questions about, well, if the plutonium isn't stolen, where is it? And how much of a hazard is it? Because, of course, if it is piling up in bins of pipes around the plant, that's probably a worse hazard than having it stolen, or at least theoretically could be. So he asked some very good questions that helped give us some contacts that we might not have had without his presence.
Was there any congressional response to this article that you wrote about the missing plutonium?
Yes, there was congressional response because, this was supposed to be the showcase plant for the new nuclear weapons buildup. There were audits made of the plant that were kept confidential, but an auditor eventually went to the Seattle Times with the audits, and so the Seattle Times was able to do a really big story on the safety, or the lack thereof, of Purex.
Did they ever locate the missing plutonium?
They decided it was not stolen, but they they didn't tell us anything else about where it was.
Amazing. Okay. So now I'm going to focus a little bit on a fairly well-known downwinder that you've known for many years.
Yeah.
His name is Tom Bailey, a farmer in Mesa, Washington. When did you first, when and how did you meet Tom Bailey first?
I met Tom Bailey not too long after the Purex story. He was in Spokane for a fundraiser for our Congressman Tom Foley, who later became House Majority Leader and House Speaker. He was, our Nancy Pelosi. And he was having a fundraiser, and Tom was there. Tom had been involved in some issues with the Bonneville Power Administration over where power lines would go, and some of them were crossing his and his neighbor's, or slated to cross his and his neighbor's property, and he wasn't happy about that. So he was lobbying Tom Foley about that and several other issues. And he was a little bit drunk at this fundraiser and kind of loud. But anyway, I went up and introduced myself, and I said I'm newly, covering Hanford and the issues around it, and I knew he lived really close by. And he said, well, the only thing Hanford ever did to us was kill a few sheep. And I'm saying, kill a few sheep, what do you mean? And so that was a story that my editors were really suspicious about. He said, well, you know, here's a loudmouth farmer just talking about, you know, sheep deaths. How do we know that anything, you know, all the stories out of the AP, all the stories out of the Department of Energy, Hanford has always been perfectly safe. So where's the story? And I said, well, I'll look for some documents. And before the larger Freedom of Information Act request came, well, 6 months later, I did a lot of research on my own, and I found for available documents that show there had been accidents that affected the farm community where he lived, just across from Hanford. And so, based on those documents, I got the go-ahead to go down and visit him in Mesa. And what Tom did was drive me around for a day and a half and introduce me to many of his neighbors, Leon and Juanita Andrzejewski, who were keeping a death map. You know, there were two farmers. They'd been there a long, long time, I think since 1954, if I'm remembering correctly. They had kept a map of all their neighbors who had died of either cancers or heart attacks, and they had this all X's and O's for heart attacks, and they told me that they had been worried, but they had never said anything about their worries except within this tight-knit farming community. And we went to several other neighbors' houses, and there are lots of Mormons in this community, and some of them, well, they tend to be very patriotic, and they didn't really want to talk about government, possible government injury. So we went on to other farmhouses, and we met many, many other people who did want to talk about the fact that they'd always been concerned that there are probably illnesses or accidents that might have affected them at Hanford.
Thank you for watching our video. It is our hope that our stories will increase public awareness of the catastrophic human toll of Hanford operations. The plight of the Hanford downwinders demonstrates in no uncertain terms the crucial importance of the role of public oversight of government programs and activities. Public and congressional oversight that might have put public protections in place were absent during the decades of the Federal Manhattan Project and Cold War-era nuclear weapons production and testing program, which has resulted in death and grievous injury to many civilians downwind. Net proceeds from the Hanford Plaintiffs benefits Consequences of Radiation Exposure, a Washington state nonprofit and 501c3 tax-exempt organization whose primary mission is to advance and disseminate understanding of the human toll of exposure to ionizing radiation from uranium mining, milling, or transport, nuclear weapons production, testing, or use in warfare, nuclear reactor off-site releases, and related radiation exposures. CORE's website is found at www.corehanford.org. Thank you.